Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Without further ado, I would like to turn things over and introduce our keynote speaker today, Rita Kohli. Dr. Kohli is an associate professor of teaching and teacher education in the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Riverside, and is the co-founder and co-director of the Institute for Teachers of Color Committed to Racial Justice. Her research examines the professional experiences and well-being of teachers of color as it is impacted by racism and racial justice work. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Rita. Really looking forward to this. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Good morning. I am so honored at the opportunity to share some of my work and to build upon some of the conversations that you've been having on race and teacher education. I had a chance to see Dr. Howard's keynote yesterday, and I'm excited in the ways in which I can build from some of the dialogue that was happening. So today I am going to, there are going to be a few moments in my talk where I'm going to ask for you to respond in the chat, where I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to have you all kind of use your camera to answer a certain question, and at the end we will be in breakout groups. So I know that sometimes when we're on webinars, we're like doing the dishes and folding laundry during the pandemic. And so I just want people to be ready and aware that there will be some moments here where I'm gonna ask for some participation. So I'm gonna talk today about fostering a healthy racial climate in teacher education, but really where I want to start is thinking about the experiences of teachers of color that come through our programs. And so I'm going to share, I'm going to start with a story about a teacher candidate from a California teacher education program. I'm going to share several stories from different teacher education programs. And so I want us to listen from an open place and not wonder, was this my program? So this is about a story about a teacher candidate named Carla. So Carla was born in Mexico, but resettled with her family in a small rural town in California when she was 4 years old. Throughout her education, she went to a school with a significant population of Latinx students, but she never had a Latinx teacher, and the predominantly white teachers she did have viewed her family and community through a deficit lens, and even ridiculed her parents. In college, she took a few education classes that helped her problematize her educational journey, and she decided to become an elementary teacher. She said, "I wanted to be the teacher who would understand my students and the inequities going on in the school. I wanted to be that teacher I never had." Once in the credential program, Carla quickly realized that it was not providing the tools she needed to be the teacher she envisioned. The theoretical frames that drove her to the classroom were absent. She watched as white students would receive praise for surface-level attempts to discuss equity. And when she tried to assert her critical understandings, she felt silenced. In her student teaching placement, Carla shared how she had to sit through lectures that neglected students' realities and identities, but her guiding teacher was upset that Carla was not following her modeling in the classroom. She eventually said, "If the principal asks if I should give you a job, I will say no. I think you should reconsider teaching. I don't think this is the job for you." While this is happening, Carla started experiencing continuous chest pains. One day, she was driving from student teaching to class, and her left side went numb. She thought she was having a heart attack. Scared, she checked herself into the hospital, and after some tests, the doctors determined that the root was extreme stress. While we know teaching and teacher education programs can be stressful for all teacher candidates, this is compounded for teachers of color with racial stress. So when we think about the experience of Carla, we understand that she felt racially marginalized in her space. She had dreams of becoming a teacher for her community that could serve her students in a way that she was not served. But through this racial marginalization, she experienced racial battle fatigue, which is the psychological, emotional, physiological, energy, and time-related cost of fighting against racism. So William Smith and some colleagues have studied that racism, the ongoing impacts of racism, and compared it to the impact that soldiers have coming back from war, that they can experience actual physical ramifications of this, just like we saw Carla experience with her chest pains. And it can also lead to professional push-out, where students are being, teacher candidates or teachers are being systematically forced out of the profession due to the lack of support, encouragement, or an inclusive environment. And so as we saw with Carla, her guiding teacher told her, this isn't a job for you. And after her program, Carla really struggled to want to apply for jobs because she felt so diminished by the experience that she had in her teacher education program. And so I tell this story at the start of my talk to really help us think through, what is it that we want our programs to be like? And who do we want the students in K-12 schools across California to have as teachers? And for Carla, for example, who really wanted to make that impact in her community, she felt deterred by our actual programs and the kind of choices and the systems that exist in our programs. And so today what I want us to really think about is the racialized experiences of teachers of color, and then to also reflect on how we can foster healthy racial climates that better support their growth and success. So just like Lisa's call, I think it's important to operationalize terms so we have a shared understanding of what I'm talking about. So today I'm talking about teachers of color. And so I wanted to name that this is a label to aggregate various groups of racially minoritized educators. And I also want to say that I know that there are problems with a collapsed label like this. And so it's not meant to erase the experiences and needs of singular racial groups, but rather to point to their racialization and shared experiences underrepresented in the teaching force. And I talk about this a lot because I think there has been a significant amount of research that has showed that having teachers of color play a strong role at much of the research is about how it's impacted students of color's academic engagement and success. That teachers of color tend to have higher expectations of students of color, more multicultural awareness and cultural responsiveness, that they tend to be cultural brokers between families and communities. And in the past couple of years, there's also been research that shows that students of all races demonstrated preferences for teaching approaches of teachers of color. Okay, so what I'd like to do right now, I'm going to have you take a minute and I want you to reflect on the number of teachers of color you had in your own education. I know on social media there's been a question about Black male teachers, and that's been very eye-opening to see. But I want you to reflect for a minute, and I'm gonna stop sharing, and if people could please turn on their cameras, and as I name the numbers, I want you to start to turn your cameras off. And so think from kindergarten through 12th grade. If we think about it, we have teachers, changing teachers, all of that. So, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. So if people could turn on their cameras. Okay, and if people could move to gallery view so you can see your colleagues. And now what I'd like to do, give me a thumbs up if you have your number. All right, so let's look for a minute. If you had at least one teacher of color, please leave your screen on. And if you didn't, turn it off. 2. I see some turning off. 3. 4. 5, 6, 7. Okay, so if you can scroll through, I would like to say when I hit 7, almost everybody's screen is off. Okay, I'm going to say 10. I should put my screen off, actually. All right, so if you have any reactions, you can put them in the chat. But if we think carefully about the number of teachers of color we have in our educational experiences, it can range somewhere between 40 to 70 to 80. And we think about how many people who've commented in the chat or participated in the activity had under 5. It really starts us to, it really helps us to reflect on the types of experiences, the types of perspectives that we were exposed to in our own educational experience, our own educational trajectory. So what does it mean when, for so many of us, our education was shaped by an overwhelmingly white teaching force? How has it influenced what curriculum we were presented with? How has it shaped how we understand knowledge and education, how we see the world? So I see Carolyn says she had none, right? So what does that mean for our education? Patty had none. Okay. So as we reflect upon our own experiences, I think it's important for us to understand how our current teaching force has been shaped historically. So the inception of schooling for communities of color sprung from a desire to rid communities of color of their cultures, languages, ways of being, and to socialize them into English, Protestant, Eurocentric ways of being instead, and to adopt their place in the racial order. So if we think about like the Carlisle Indian industrial schools or the Kailani public schools in Hawaii, you see these images of forced nationalism and cultural genocide, assimilation in these spaces, right? And that we have to remember that much of what we see in public schools started as a practice of indoctrination. But in those spaces, there is a history where teachers of color have served as subversive forces. From the late 19th century, indigenous teachers in those Indian schools disrupting efforts towards cultural annihilation in the government-sponsored schools. In Los Angeles County, for example, in the 1920s, when education was being guided by overt English-only mandates, Mexican Council opened schools staffed with Mexican educators who taught in Spanish language and taught Mexican history. And during segregation, there were also numerous accounts of African-American teachers who supported, cared for, and engaged the young of their community with high expectations. And so with the call for legal integration, white families feared their children would be educated by non-white teachers. So Brown versus Board of Education was one of those legislations that has shaped, the diversity of the people on this call itself, right? There are a lot of important gains that have come from it. But one of the side effects that we rarely consider is that because of this fear of children being educated by non-white teachers during integration across the South, African-American principals, teachers, counselors, coaches, band directors, cafeteria workers were harassed, bullied, demoted, or fired. By 1964, at least 45% of Black teachers had been fired or pushed out of schools. So I want us to reflect on that almost half. So after Brown versus Board of Education, almost half of Black teachers across the country had been fired or pushed out. And so I think that it's always really important for us to understand how we got where we did and what kinds of history shapes that. So now we're in a context where the majority of students in US public schools are students of color. So if we look here, we had this decline in white students where in fall 2017, we were at 48% and moving towards just 44%. And while our teaching force is also diversifying, it's not diversifying at the rate that our student population is diversifying. And so we're seeing this widening gap. And when we think about California, we think many of us, I mean, I live in Los Angeles County where there are a lot of teachers of color, and people really think, you know, California may be different, but I want us to also note that in California, there are still these demographic disparities from student to teacher. Okay, so now that I'm seeing all of these wonderful comments of people really reflecting deeply. I mean, they're not wonderful because they're saying that there are very few teachers of color, but people are reflecting deeply on who they were educated by and how that impacted them. And so I want us to think about that conversation in connection to our own programs for a minute. So as a system, we produce teachers across the state. So what do these numbers mean on our individual campuses, and what does it mean collectively? So I'm going to put a couple questions in the chat, and I just want you to reflect on. What are your noticings? Is anything surprising to you? Are there any patterns you see? What or might be the consequences of these patterns in our programs in the field?
Rita, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have access to similar data for the Cal States, which are cheaper? Oftentimes students can live at home as well as tuition being less. I'm wondering why there are so fewer minorities in the UCs. And so I would love to see a Cal State comparison.
Yeah, I mean,
a math teacher.
No, I don't have that data on hand, but I would say it depends on the Cal State. So I think there's schools like Cal State Dominguez Hills that are very highly in students of color, and then you have places like San Jose State and other, you know, CSUs in other areas that maybe aren't representing their regions either. And so I mean, we're underrepresented as a state in terms of who our teachers are. And so, but I do believe that the UC system-wide is contributing to this. If we think of ourselves, if we want to think of ourselves as leaders in shaping the field of education, I think it is important that we reflect on, we produced as a system 29 Black teachers into California last year or 2 years ago, right? And so what does that really mean? And I think also thinking about the experiences of the teachers that we do recruit into our program. What is it like for them to be part of programs that are so underrepresented? But thank you for that question. And I think that is data we should definitely pull up and compare. So there's some really great comments in the chat. And I see people saying things about, you know, that maybe where the UC is located and how expensive it is and things like that. And so I think it is, these things are very valid. And it's also important for us to really think about, as we move through this talk, what are the ways in which our systems are creating barriers for diversifying the teaching force and diversifying our UC system. All right. So I think it's also really important for us to recognize that even with recruitment, where there's a lot of focus on recruitment, and even if we do a really good job starting to recruit teachers of color into our programs, they move schools or leave the profession at an annual rate higher than white teachers do. So there has been documentation of this kind of, we're bringing in teachers of color, but they're also leaving or being, feeling the need to shift schools at a much higher rate. And so some of the research has shown that it's because they work at schools with less resources and higher turnover, that they report a lack of administrative support, a lack of classroom autonomy and school influence, and poor teaching conditions. And so kind of partnered with that is the work of myself and some of our colleagues at thinking about the experience, how hostile racial climates in teaching and teacher education really influences. So going back to that story of Carla and really trying to unpack what's happening in our programs for these students who are many of them want to go back and teach in their own communities or teach in similar communities, and how are we serving, how are the climates of our programs serving to interrupt that process. So I wanted to know, thinking about all of this, and recognizing that we're talking about a predominantly white profession. And when we think about higher education or medical school or the legal field, there is a lot of research that shows that entering predominantly white professions as minoritized people has a deep impact, and people can experience a lot of racial harm. And the same is, in my research, I found that the same is true for teachers of color. So despite working in communities of color where they're serving families and students that reflect them or are also racially minoritized, you have a system that is steeped in whiteness. You have a profession that is predominantly white. You have administrators that also reflect those demographics. I think somewhere between 70 and 80%. 85% of administrators are also white and monolingual, right? And so we're having this disconnect where we're seeing recruitment efforts that are leading to this kind of attrition anyway. And so I wanted to understand, how do we prepare teachers of color to actually navigate and thrive? And so I did a study with some veteran educators of color who had demonstrated social justice leadership in their classrooms. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my findings here. That out of the teachers that I talked to, half of them said that they went to programs kind of like Carla, where they felt alienated as someone who was committed to justice, who was a teacher of color. So you have the experience of Lisa, who was a Filipina high school English teacher, and she was reflecting on attending a credential program in Southern California. And she said, people who had no idea what I was about or what I wanted to do were choosing all these things and lecturing. It's like, I don't value the same things that you value as an educator. I don't have the same experiences that you have as an educator. Issues that interested me of why I wanted to become a teacher weren't brought up at all. It wasn't at all anything that I believed in terms of what I wanted to teach. I just kind of had to get through the work, right? And I know these are hard stories to hear because we care so much about what we do and we put so much into what we do, but I think it's really important that we pause and we listen to how the way we've shaped our climate is landing for some of these teachers. Carrie, who is a Black high school social studies teacher, also attended a Southern California teacher education program. And I promise these are not all my program or even any of them. So I just want to make sure that we understand these are universal themes that I was seeing across a lot of the programs across California. So Carrie says, my program would not talk about social justice. It was almost like a secret thing. So I wore a mask. I just saw someone in the 1960s talk about Du Bois and talk about how the African American always straddles two fences. I had fallen for the belief that I'm supposed to wear two hats, two faces. Back then, I did a lot of crying in the bathroom stalls, right? So when we think about those numbers, where we're looking at the numbers of Black students, 29 Black teacher candidates across the UC, and we have Black teacher candidates who are crying in the bathroom stalls, right? We are failing as a system in terms of what we're trying to do to create diverse and reflective teaching forces, right? We have to do better. And what was interesting, I think, in my own research that surprised me as well is that I knew that there were moments and programs where teachers of color felt marginalized from those spaces. But then I learned from this study that there were actually students who went to programs that were really justice oriented and they felt really affirmed in their programs. But when they made it out into the field, they realized that their program had fallen short in preparing them to understand what it meant to be a person of color in a predominantly white profession. So I'm going to share the story of who's an Asian American elementary school teacher in the Bay Area, and she attended a teacher education program in San Francisco that emphasized community engagement. So she said, on the last Saturday of every month, we would advertise, and lots of families and the neighborhood would come, and we would do these literacy workshops, and then have a big potluck and some singing or puppet show. Just something we would perform for the families in the mission. We would cook the food and serve it, and just felt like it was a beautiful community connection. It taught me the value of building those relationships with people in your community. The program drew a fair amount of like-minded individuals, but it was still a pretty white cohort overall. There was space to talk about the needs of kids of color and make sure that it was something that everyone in the room was thinking about, putting energy into, and prioritizing. There wasn't much dialogue about what it is to be an educator of color. When I got into the workforce as a teacher of color, it was a real shock to my system. And so I'm going to share a clip from after graduating. She secured a job across the Bay at an elementary school named after a Black activist that she admired. Serving a diverse student body, she learned that the students had been exposed to very little about the namesake of the school or about their own history. So with several like-minded teachers at the school, she planned several different events that centered Black and other people of color histories, cultures, and activism. And although the community was excited and engaged, the predominantly white teaching staff resisted and even undermined these efforts, expressing shame and embarrassment in celebrating such radical history. So they began to personally target her, making it challenging for her to get things done at work. So she went to her principal and asked him for support. And she describes their conversation. And so I want us to reflect on, what it means to be, this teacher experienced a lot of community responsive education, was affirmed to experience those things. But when she went out to try those things, her experience as a teacher of color differed greatly from the experiences of her peers who were doing the same kinds of work. And to the point where, like Carla, she was told, this isn't the job for you. This isn't the place for you. And so what I found was that many of the teachers of color across my research experienced these same struggles and ended up pushed out of their schools or their profession. But the teachers in this study had all been teaching for at least 10 years, were social justice leaders in their fields. And so when I inquired about how they were able to both stay and realize their visions, they said they found informal or out of school spaces to sustain and support teachers of color in navigating those racially hostile school climates. That they created informal teacher groups, critical inquiry groups, teacher activist organizations, and conferences that centered racial literacy. And so I wanted to hear from them what they believe should be built into teacher education that would have helped them professionally as justice-oriented teachers of color. And so what they recommended was that to effectively prepare teachers of color to navigate the realities of school climates, that teacher education should approach education through a sense of collectivism and community, to offer access to critical theory and readings from people of color theorists, to offer real, tangible discussion and tools to navigate injustice in schools, to make teacher development community responsive and addressing problems specific to their schools and communities, to hire more teacher educators of color and provide mentorship, guest lectures, and classroom visits. But much of what they're calling for are things required of teacher candidates to do with their K-12 students. So much of the things that these teachers are asking us to include in our teacher education, they're here in our teacher performance expectations. So we are asked to support teachers to create and maintain effective environments for student learning. So we're asked to develop teachers that practice foster a caring community where each student is treated fairly and respectfully, to create learning environments that reflect diversity and multiple perspectives and are culturally responsive, to establish, maintain, and monitor inclusive learning environments that are physically, mentally, intellectually, and emotionally healthy and safe to enable that all students can learn and recognize appropriately address instances of intolerance, harassment among students, such as bullying, racism, and sexism, right? So there are all these beautiful things that we're being asked to support teachers to develop into, in essence, for them to create a healthy racial climate for their students. But what if our programs actually held ourselves to the same standards? So when we look at the program standards, I won't go in a lot of detail about it right now, but when we unpack these things and we look in them deeply, we realize that they actually aren't carrying that same language. They don't have the same kinds of, we aren't held to the same standard of creating positive, healthy racial climates. And so I am part of a CTERIN funded collective that is between UCLA, UC Riverside, and Cal State Fullerton. And Darlene Lee, who I know did a great workshop yesterday, and Emma Hipolito, who's the director of the teacher ed program at UCLA. We're both part of that, who are with us today. And we work together with, as teacher educator scholars and practitioners with higher education scholars to create a model for what does a healthy racial climate in teacher education look like. And so what we define it as is culturally sustaining space where all members strengthen their racial literacies and exercise agency to promote racial justice at individual and institutional levels within all contexts of the program. And so again, going back to Lisa's call for us to define things, I want to explain a little bit what I mean by racial literacy. And so I think sometimes we get into this habit of like, people are down or they're not, they're woke or they're not, they're conscious or they're not. And I want to disrupt that idea and really think about racial literacy as a skill and a practice and something that comes from the work and reflection. But it's possible for people to get there, right? And so what this is the ability to probe the existence of racism and examine the effects of race in institutionalized systems on their experiences and representation in US society. So we need racial literacy to disrupt and transform the social, historical, and political climate. And so what we're calling for is a racial literacy on both a programmatic level and on individual levels of people in the program. Oops, sorry, it's going that way. And so Allison Scarrett has developed this kind of continuum for racial literacy, and her research is with English teachers, but I think it applies also for us as teacher educators and supervisors. When teachers feel discomfort or fear to talk and teach about race, their opportunities and their students' opportunities to develop racial literacy are restricted. And so this is that kind of apprehensive where we're stuck in a place of fear. And then along the continuum is this notion of incidental racial literacy, which is we don't proactively talk about race and racism, but if those conversations come up in class or in moments, then we'll respond to them. But still, that what Allison Scarrett is pushing us towards is this kind of sustained and strategic approach to racial literacy. So when these things are actually embedded in instruction proactively, that race serves as a diagnostic tool that guides teachers' curriculum and instructional philosophies and practices. And so it's deeply embedded into the pedagogy and the lens through which they're understanding schools. And so really thinking about how do we move our programs to a place of sustained and strategic racial literacy, and how do we as individuals get there? What is the type of work that we need to do to ensure that we have the capacity to be able to name, understand, respond, disrupt the racial harm that we're seeing in our programs, and how are we supporting our students to get there as well? And so our model builds from higher education, and Sylvia Hurtado from UCLA developed with colleagues this model that helps us look at the organizational structure. So thinking about the historical, so I started with the historical. So acknowledging and addressing legacies of racism. So do we know in our programs what the historical legacy of racism is in our programs. How long were our programs segregated for? When did they start to integrate? What is our relationship with First Nations and the land that we're on, right? So do we know those things in our programs? There is a program in University of Madison, Wisconsin, which has a really powerful, there is a First Nations liaison on campus that does a First Nations tour, and every credential student takes a 2-hour tour around campus to learn about how the institution has created harm for Indigenous people in that area, right? And it changes the way that they understand and teach history and teach all subjects, right? The organizational and structural, so thinking about admissions, thinking about curriculum, thinking about the way, like, are all the social justice classes, content clustered in one class, or are they strategically spread throughout? Is this a consistent ideology that we express in terms of who we let into programs? The compositional part of this is not just how do we have people of color in a program, but how do we have a critical mass of people of color, and how do we have a critical mass of particular groups, right? If we go back to that UC data and we see that there was one Black teacher or one Indigenous teacher, that is not critical mass for that racial group or for that person, right? So what is that experience like for them? So how do we move towards having a critical mass in our programs? And then thinking about the interactions. How do the interactions create a climate in our program, right? Are there the peer interactions, the supervisor and teacher educator, instructor guiding teacher towards teacher candidate, all those different ways that their students are experiencing the program? What do those, are those purposeful engagement that reflects and promotes racial literacy? And then the psychological tool, right? So think the dimension, thinking about how this impacts teachers of color. How do they feel? How is their well-being supported? So going back to Carla and really thinking about, what if we were to name and go through these different dimensions, what is she experiencing? And that psychological and physical toll was really toxic and harmful, right? So we're moving to a place where teacher candidates of color feel supported. And so what I'd like for us to do right now is I have some questions that relate to the model and the article that our collective created. And I want to send you into breakout groups to take about 10 minutes and reflect on, there's a lot of questions here, but you can read them through and maybe pick one or two to reflect deeply on and discuss with each other. Welcome back, everyone. As you're coming back, if you want to type something in the chat around just maybe one meaningful thing that came from the conversation that you had. Okay, so I just wanted to close, and open for questions, but I wanted to just say that, I think it's important for us to engage in this reflection, and please, as you're writing in the chat, I would love to reflect and hear how this is landing for you. But I want to just emphasize that I think, students deserve teachers that reflect their communities and the growing diversity of our state. And teacher education programs have a role in disrupting the demographic divide and systemically supporting the growth of diverse teaching force. We have agency, right? We have agency to shape what our admissions process are and who becomes teachers. We have agency to shape what those programs look like, how students of color experience those programs, how we're preparing them realistically to understand a lot of the challenges that Dr. Howard was talking about yesterday. And I know a lot of the questions that I had you reflect on today were related to his talk as well. And that as supervisors, you have agency and an important role in shaping the racial climate as well. So I wanted to open it up. Reading the chat, but open it up and see if anyone had any quick questions before we end.
Do you have an example of a program or things that have done that really work? Anything that you could share with us in that regard?
Yeah, I think I shared an example of the University of Madison, Wisconsin. I think that's a really powerful model of kind of addressing the historical dimension. I think, UCLA's program, where I know Emma and Darlene and others who are there will not always, they're not, they're always still striving for something better, but I believe that there's a lot that they're doing there. I think that there's a lot we can learn from the model of our colleagues there in terms of how they've really transformed, even since I was a supervisor there, the demographics of the program, the ideological commitments of the program. And so, I think that in our system, that's a great resource.
All right, thank you so much. I know there are a lot of good comments in the chat, so maybe we'll just leave that open for a minute, but I wanted to say thank you again for taking the time today, Rita. We really appreciate it.